From the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Alex Bruins. Welcome to NCITE Insights. Our guest today is Jake Braun. He's the Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Initiative at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Jake is the author of the new book, Fentanyl, Fighting the Mass Poisoning of America and the Cartel Behind It, and joins us via Zoom. Jake Braun, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Alex, and thanks for Insights for having me as well.
So before we dive into some of the specifics, I think it'd be great to talk about how fentanyl has become a mass poisoning in America. So in 2021, fentanyl overdose deaths reached 100,000 in America. And thanks in part to your work at DHS in 2024, that has been halved to 48,000. And so to set the stage, it'd be great if you give us an overview of how fentanyl comes to our communities and what is the role of cartels like Sinaloa in that process.
Sure. It is truly fascinating. And like I say, when I was in the Obama administration, about in 2009 or 10, one of my bosses looked at me and said, "Hey, I'm being asked to take over cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland Security." And I said, "Ma'am," her name was Jane Lute, Deputy Cabinet Secretary. And I said, "Ma'am, I can't spell cybersecurity." And she's like, "That's okay. Nobody else can except the IT people anyway. We'll figure it out as we go." And that was kind of how cyber was back in 2009. It wasn't really a thing. Fentanyl was the same thing. I remember when they asked me to be the point person in the front office for fentanyl, front office of Homeland Security. I said, "Sir," to Secretary Mayorkas, I'm like, I can't spell fentanyl. I don't know anything about this. And he said, "Well, that's okay. It's a pretty new threat." But literally the first 6 months I worked on it, every time I typed the word fentanyl, a little red line would come under it because I literally couldn't spell it. It wasn't until later that I would spell it correctly. So you're right. My background was in no way tied to drug policy or fentanyl, but I think there's a couple of things. So to talk initially about how it's a mass poisoning, I'll tell you a story from the book. So I think about my friends in high school. Everybody smoked weed. Everybody started drinking when they were in freshman year. Most people who did drugs started smoking weed in sophomore year. A lot of people were doing LSD and mushrooms and stuff back then. This was the 90s when those were way more popular. You contrast that with this kid, Zach. That's his real name. Zach is from Southern California, star athlete, in the school plays, honors club. I mean, this model kid. Zach gets micro-targeted in a mall that he went to with his friends by some dealer who was selling him what they thought was Percocet. And since I guess this kid, Zach, had some, he was sore because he worked out a lot because he was a varsity athlete, takes this drug, didn't take it immediately, goes home, buys it at the place, goes home. Christmas Day, goes to bed, says goodnight to his dad. His dad walks into his room the next morning, finds him dead at his desk. The kid had no idea that he wasn't taking Percocet. He was taking fentanyl. It just looked like a Percocet pill. The thing that people don't get about fentanyl is that almost no one seeks fentanyl. You have to be really kind of, hopelessly, I don't want to say hopelessly, but, seriously have serious addiction problems to go look for fentanyl. Largely, it's being cut into cocaine, it's being cut into heroin, it's being cut into other drugs. And most people who use drugs are avoiding fentanyl like the plague. The worst thing, which we can get into later, is that the cartels have figured out that we're on the back end of an opioid epidemic in this country, where have been weaning people off Oxycontin and all these things for years. And so lo and behold, they start to make fentanyl into pills that look like Oxycontin and Vicodin and even Tramadol and Viagra and things like that. And so unlike crack cocaine in the 80s, which was like maybe the last big epidemic, or Oxycontin for that matter, where people may not have known the dangers, but they at least knew what they were taking, and we could educate them not to take it. In the case of fentanyl, most of the people doing it have no idea they're taking it, which is very similar to how one would get poisoned.
Right.
The whole implication of poison is that you don't know that you're taking it. And that's where fentanyl is categorically different than other drug issues that we've had in this country. Now, in terms of how it gets here, this whole thing about it being obfuscated really goes back to kind of the transformation of the Sinaloa cartel and how they have relationships going back over a century to organized crime and others in China, who Chinese chemical, they basically have deals with Chinese chemical companies where they provide the precursor chemicals needed to make fentanyl to the cartels. The biggest, baddest one is the Sinaloa cartel that really sells the most fentanyl in the country. So they're mostly like the eastern part, northeastern part of Mexico, although they're a global cartel, maybe the biggest criminal organization in the world, certainly top three. They get these precursors. They fashion those into pills that look like Oxycontin, or they put it in the heroin or coke or whatever else they're selling. And then they have a gazillion different ways of getting it into the United States, whether it be through tunnels. They're very famous for their tunnels. We may remember El Chapo, is the one who innovated all these tunnels they built under the border. They fly it in drones. They have submersible little submarines they use to get them across the border. They hide them in everything you can imagine. And then once it gets here, it'll go to your typical street dealer, or oftentimes it may go to a larger dealer, but then if it is fake Oxycontin or fake Tramadol or fake whatever, it'll wind up in a bottle that often looks like a prescription bottle. And a lot of the saddest stories you hear are kids who thought they were getting a Xanax because they were so stressed out about finals. They wanted to take a Xanax from a friend, and both they and the friend thought that it was real Xanax. And it turns out, no, actually it's got fentanyl in it. And the kid, died because they were taking what they thought was a Xanax. Anyway, so after all this happens, the money then will go back to the Sinaloa cartel in a whole host of ways. Sometimes it's cash, sometimes it's crypto, whatever. And then increasingly, the Sinaloa cartel is actually laundering the money through Chinese money laundering organizations. So in many ways, this is like a problem that's got the Sinaloa cartel in the center of it, but it's bookended by Chinese criminal organizations, both providing the inputs and then washing the outputs, meaning the cash.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they think about Sinaloa or smuggling across the U.S. southern border, think about marijuana and cocaine and heroin, and don't really think about fake pills that are laced with fentanyl. Maybe now, maybe after many operations they do, but certainly in 2019 that was not the case, or when Zach died, that was not the case. So in the book, you talk a lot about Sinaloa. It's the major player in the production, the trafficking, and then also the distribution of these pills and of fentanyl, but also smuggling people and mass violence in Mexico. But it is so fascinating how you know that the enforcement against Sinaloa was so compartmented from the U.S. side. So in the U.S. Or across U.S. government agencies, we had a minimal understanding of Sinaloa as a whole. There wasn't a lot of information sharing. There was lots of information about individual members of the cartel or pieces of the cartel. And so part of the goal of the counter-fentanyl operation that you ran at DHS was to bring all these agencies together, to bring all this information together. Can you share a bit about how you got those agencies to come together to share information and ultimately coalesce around this issue?
Sure. And let me back up a second on Sinaloa and maybe go into a little bit about their history, so folks can get understand the scope of this organization. Because it's not like, and I know when I first was trying to think about this, I sat down and actually talked to Mayorkas and was like, hey, so, you had taken down many, serious gangs and criminal organizations when he was the DA, or I forget exactly, I think it was the DA of LA. And he looked at me, he's like, Sinaloa isn't a street gang. He's like, they're as big as a government, and they can outfight the government in certain parts of Mexico. We need a different approach than what we use with street gangs. And so I started reading a lot about it. And by the way, if anybody's interested in Sinaloa, I was in a briefing at one point, and we were learning all about them. And I had this one agent who actually worked on the El Chapo case, who was doing this debrief of how they got El Chapo and all these different tactics. It was so fascinating. And at one point, he's like, "Oh, we're late in the schedule." And so I was going to go into this history of the Sinaloa cartel. He's like, "I don't have time." He's like, "But if you're interested, watch Narcos Mexico." He's like, "It's so historically accurate." And he's like, it's Hollywood, but it's pretty historically accurate. So that was a very good excuse for me to totally binge watch Narcos Mexico, which I did. But anyway, it'll for those interested in this, I highly recommend it. But essentially, about 100 years ago, a group of folks on the border, started smuggling different things like oils and stuff into the country. After a while, actually, as the railroad was being built and Chinese workers were coming over during the middle of the opium wars to work in the United States, often were bringing poppy plants and stuff with them because they were so treated so poorly in the United States by racist issues against Asians. Many of them went to Mexico, which unfortunately for them did not turn out as well. I don't think they were treated much better there. But the same group that was smuggling other things in the United States realized, oh, well, there's now a community that we could smuggle heroin to, or opium, I guess, at the time. Yeah. And that's where the drug trade kind of started. But that was mostly to Asian communities that had just come over. Over time, though, after this infrastructure had been built, the U.S. temperance movement steps in, makes alcohol illegal, and then all of a sudden it's Sally bar the door. These guys are just making money hand over fist, smuggling booze into the country. And frankly, but for prohibition, we probably wouldn't have as robust of criminal enterprises across northern Mexico as we do today, because that really started this whole thing off on steroids. And then actually, the Mexican government makes marijuana illegal before the U.S. does. But a few years after prohibition was over, we made marijuana essentially illegal, and then it starts over. So at one point, the guy who runs Sinaloa cartel, this guy Felix Guiardo, whose name I just butchered, so we can just call him Felix, basically takes over all these little cartels and creates what we now know today as Sinaloa, which is the Guadalajara cartel. They then, through some brilliant stuff that would take me hours to explain, figure out how to take over the cocaine trade from the Colombians. And so now they own marijuana and cocaine, and they own the whole southern border. Through that, they're able to get into every other criminal enterprise you can imagine, whether it be prostitution, gambling, extortion, fake avocados, like come up with, whatever. And that really helps them grow into an organization the size of a Fortune 50 company that, again, can outfight the government in certain parts of Mexico today. And so as we were kind of trying to wrap our arms around thinking about this, we were like, well, the DEA knows a lot because they know about all these drug cases. But the problem is Sinaloa does so much more than drugs. That wasn't enough. DHS, our HSI folks, Homeland Security Investigations, the investigators, they knew a lot about human trafficking and also drugs and so on, but weren't necessarily always connected with DEA and so on. The intel folks, so NSA, CIA, and then the Pentagon's intel folks, they didn't really care about narcotics or cartels for that matter. But as they were collecting about other things, like what's China doing in Latin America or what's Russia doing or whatever, they would get stuff, but they often didn't pass it to us. And then you have like local law enforcement who would get pieces of the pie, but often that didn't, kind of bubble up to the feds. And so we constantly were just sitting there saying, like, everybody's got their part of the elephant they see, but nobody has their hands around the whole thing. And then this guy, so I call the Intel Division of Homeland Security, called INA, Intel and Analysis, who is our liaison to the intelligence community, so CIA, NSA, whatever. And I say, what do you guys think? How can we do a better job of this? And so they send me this guy, Phil Groven, who's been in the IC for years. And he's like, you guys should set up an equivalent of Gallant Phoenix. So Gallant Phoenix was something that was set up during the War on Terror in Jordan to basically bring in international partners, plus every military, law enforcement, IC, or intel organization, so on, into one place. And all they did was sit there all day and look at how to go after ISIS and Al Qaeda, but mainly ISIS because that was a problem at the time. And they were in particular focused on places that you could not do, where you couldn't just drop a bomb on somebody. So terrorists who were in Europe or in other parts of the Middle East that were not Iraq or Afghanistan, or wherever else in the world. And so we're like, oh, well, that actually kind of fits our situation much better because we can't, or probably shouldn't be dropping bombs on Mexico, or any number of other places for that matter. But bringing all these folks together, having them sit in one place, and kind of forcing them to share information because of their proximity and so on, was something we started to work on. We actually brought in a guy, General Fernando Lujan, who helped stand up Gallant Phoenix during the War on Terror, and brought him in to put together a plan on how we were going to do this for the federal government. So we truly did just take playbooks straight out of the War on Terror and applied them directly to this problem.
Yeah, and that was Operation Blue Lotus, correct?
Well, so that became, yes. I mean, not exactly. That's largely an intel thing. Operation Blue Lotus was a manifestation of
Right.
what we did.
So once you had these agencies together, once you set up the intelligence collection through the reworked Operation Gallant Phoenix, then you went about actually implementing it through Blue Lotus. Talk about that sting operation. So in the first couple months, I think you arrested 300 cartel affiliates in the first 3 months. And so that was a major sting operation against Sinaloa, using CBP, Homeland Security Investigations, and all of that intelligence from the reworked Gallant Phoenix. I'd love to hear a bit about how that went down, and kind of what were the other ways that U.S. government was working against Sinaloa or working to take down Sinaloa at the same time.
Sure. Yeah. So we, brought all these folks together to basically put together this plan. Again, we brought in a bunch of counterterrorism folks to figure out how to repurpose it, like repurpose what we did in the War on Terror for this. And after kind of the planning and everything, everybody, and don't get me wrong, there were cases being run against Sinaloa and had been for years on a whole host of things, including fentanyl. So it's not like it's like people weren't doing anything while we were planning, but people were doing what they had been doing for years, and we were planning for a new kind of offensive against these guys. And the key to that was that we decided we were going to take a counter network approach like they did in the War on Terror, as opposed to a counter kingpin approach like law enforcement normally would do with a big criminal enterprise. So, think taking down Al Capone or
Or El Chapo.
or whoever, right? And we decided that didn't work. But there's been a lot of El Chapos, and we've like in Three Amigos, and I think they talk about there's many El Chapos. Well, there actually is, and we've taken out all of them, and Sinaloa is stronger than it's ever been. So as we started to look at this, we were like, okay, we need to be hitting these guys from multiple places all at once. It's not just rolling up a bunch of people till we get to the top guys. So we want to hit their logistics operations. We want to hit their labs where they make fentanyl. We want to take out their brokers, their chemists, all these different folks. And also we want to do it in a way where it's pretty public so that they know what's happening. I mean, they'd know it's happening by one-offs anyway, but we did press releases about it, largely because we also wanted to see what they would do so this was like both pound on the bad guys and collect intel so we can go pound on the bad guys again because we're smarter, which is, again, something we learned from the War on Terror. General McChrystal talks about this all the time. So we're in this meeting going through the plan, and the secretary is like, all right, great. I want to do a blitz. I want to do a massive operation on the border. Let these guys know that, we're serious. And also to let them know that this is specifically, we're doing this specifically because of fentanyl. Not like we weren't, that we didn't care about coke or heroin or any of the other bad stuff they're doing, but they need to know that this much heat is coming at them because of what they're doing on fentanyl, because that's what's killing the vast majority of people that are dying from overdoses. To let them know that the price of them getting involved in this or selling this drug is far higher than the price for selling these other drugs that are bad but far less deadly. So we deploy several hundred HSI agents. We redeploy a bunch of CBP folks. We turn on, for lack of a better term, a bunch of sensing technologies. I can't go into what it is, but ways in which to see what's going on. Yeah. And then at the same time, DEA had been working on an operation to take out a bunch of kind of senior level lieutenants, like almost like vice president level type folks in Sinaloa. So we were hitting them kind of in the middle and bottom, and they were hitting them at the top. Treasury had been putting together sanction packages to put sanctions on a whole host of Sinaloa leaders and so on at the same time. State Department did something that may seem like it's just bells and whistles, but really has an impact, which is they took a bunch of Sinaloa folks and put them on the State Department's global most wanted list, which essentially means that these guys can't travel anywhere in the world without somebody trying to pick them up, because if for nothing else than just the reward, because it's usually millions of, and in this case it was millions of dollars per person. And oftentimes what happens is their colleagues, the other mafiosi guys, will turn them in because they want the reward money, particularly if they're in a feud with the other guy. This type of backstabbing happens all the time, as you can imagine. So oftentimes, in normal order of going after criminal organizations, these things wouldn't be connected. They would be done, sporadically and kind of catch as one can, so on and so on. But this time it was, we're going to plan this all at once. We're going to do it all at once. We're just going to pound on these guys, for weeks on end. And you're right. Within a few weeks, we had arrested hundreds. By the end, it was thousands. We had confiscated, thousands of pounds of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors, not to mention a bunch of other drugs, as you can imagine. The DEA, of course, did a great job with what they were doing and wound up arresting a lot of these key lieutenants and so on that we were after. The Treasury sanctions went out against the Sinaloa folks and against a bunch of Chinese chemical companies, by the way, which was hugely important for us. And then, of course, State Department did what they did. So we kind of, really pounded on these guys all at once. And within a few months, and a lot of people have different views as to why they did this, but Sinaloa was doing things like hanging people who they had murdered, who according to them were responsible for a lot of the fentanyl business in the cartel, like literally had beheaded them and then were hanging the rest of their bodies from overpasses with they like blood-stained sheets as billboards, with big blood-stained sheets that said something like, we're not selling, I forget exactly what it was, but something to the effect of, we're against selling fentanyl and we're going to assassinate anybody part of our organization who's doing it. Now, to be clear, a lot of my friends in law enforcement are like, yeah, they do these bloodlettings all the time, and they try and sometimes couch it as something we want, so they maybe get credit for it. But two things are true. Number one, they had never done anything like this before. And so they clearly gotten a message for sure. And two, if one of the objectives of this is to get cartel members to turn on each other because we've turned up the heat so much, well, regardless of the motivations, like objective achieved, And so I think we were very emboldened by Operation Blue Lotus and a lot of our, very brave, men and women who work in law enforcement and the military and the intelligence community did learn a ton. And then wave after after that of different named operations, wound up being quite successful as well. And as you said, the numbers have dropped dramatically. I mean, we haven't seen fatality drops like this year over year in really any drug epidemic that I'm aware of, except for fentanyl. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Education is certainly one of them. Access to naloxone and other things like that is another. But it would be hard to say that none of this stuff actually had an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's a pretty successful operation when you have when you turn the organization against itself. This is one priority area that you focused on at DHS, and you opened the book talking a lot about different priority areas. So many high priority, high stress issues faced DHS, faced you in this new position as you're trying to figure out how to spell fentanyl. How did you prioritize your work at DHS, and how did you cut through the red tape to get successes? Working with many different agencies on Blue Lotus, or working on bringing in generals from Gallant Phoenix. Like, how did you kind of come up with all these ideas for all the other issues as well?
So a couple different things. One, and this is definitely true for any of your listeners who wind up getting senior level positions in government, but I really think it's true in life in general, is that you got to kind of pick three things, and then just do the hell out of those three things. So one of the things that didn't make it in the book, because it was insanely boring, was part of my job was also putting together a whole workforce management program for the department, because our morale was chronically low for decades, and trying to do that. Very impactful, also incredibly boring and not worth writing a book about. But that was kind of one of the three things. I got assigned that, I got assigned fentanyl, and then of course the Afghan withdrawal. And I think if you say, okay, I'm just going to do three things and I'm going to do them incredibly well, then the answers kind of become obvious. It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to mess around with this stupid thing over here that just popped up that everybody cares about, because I'm working on fentanyl, which is a life and death thing. Like, that obviously should be one of the top three, or the Afghan withdrawal. Like, okay, there's hundreds of thousands of people or maybe millions who will die if we get this wrong. So, I'm going to focus, a lot of time and energy on that. And then sometimes one of your three gets assigned to you, like the workforce thing. But I mean, fewer than two. I think it's not great to have just one thing, because then you can get too myopic. 5 is definitely too many. 3 is kind of the sweet spot. But I know it's kind of a tactical answer, but it really is. You kind of got to pick your things and then just do the hell out of those things. The other thing was, since I couldn't spell fentanyl literally, I went on a reading binge on everything that I could get my hands on. And so and I love to listen to books. So every day on the way into work, I was listening to some book about the Sinaloa cartel, or kingpins we've taken down in the past, or the history of China and the drug trade, all these different things you can think about, or you can imagine. And getting yourself smart on a topic matters. I go from sitting in a room, really. The only thing I was bringing to the table was I was from the front office of the department, to sitting in a room and being able to rattle off stats from stuff that happened 50 years ago in Sonora, or other times that things have been successful, in Colombia or something like that, that we had done. And so getting yourself smart on a topic matters a lot. By the way, as a side note, to any of the young people who are listening, one of the best things I've ever done in my career was, and it wasn't by design, I just kind of happened upon it, is reading biographies of people who are in spaces particularly similar to yourself, but even not, because it turns out all these like really important, successful people have gone through at least something that's very similar to what you're dealing with. And when you're dealing with it in your life, you're like, oh, this is totally new and new to me and everything else. Whereas if you've read about it in a bunch of biographies, you're like, oh, actually, you know what? Whatever. Leonardo da Vinci went through this, and so did Benjamin Franklin, and so did blah, blah, blah. Like, I remember when I was at the White House, the staff would come to me and say, oh my God, we've got a morale problem. And I would say, huh, that's interesting. Well, why don't you go back and read James Baker, for example, the chief of staff to Reagan. Read his book about the White House, or Ivo Daalder, who wrote about all the chiefs of staff to the presidents for the last 50 years. Read those books, and you'll see that the White House always has bad morale because you've got all these type A personalities dealing with like these incredibly difficult issues, and it's super high stakes, and there's never enough time in the day. So guess what? Everybody fights all the time. And so I would never have had that frame of reference had I not read all these books about people who worked in the White House. And so I think, again, it's for those people who are coming up in their career, it's probably one of the best things you can do for yourself is read a lot of biographies. Yeah, I think we really did try to hammer this home, this focus on three things, and just do the hell out of them with the entire staff. I had a thing on my chalkboard behind me in my office that was eudaimonia equals GSD. Eudaimonia is like a term from Aristotle that means like living a good life or living a happy life or whatever. And GSD, of course, means get shit done. And so whenever people would be like talking about, whatever, we're going to review this document for another 3 weeks, it's easy to just point at the sign and be like, are we getting shit done or not? Because if we're not, then stop doing it, do the three things.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic advice, especially when facing so many issues and so many problems. So I want to try to wrap up our discussion with a final question. So given the designation of some of these Mexico-based transnational criminal organizations like Sinaloa Cartel as foreign terrorist organizations earlier this year by the Trump administration, what changes might you expect in the fight against Sinaloa or other cartels, in the fight against fentanyl more broadly? And where do we go from here?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot that they could do, of course. One of the things that designating them as a terrorist organization does is kind of takes the gloves off for DOD, for the military. We often were told in meeting after meeting, look, we're not at war with Mexico or the Sinaloa cartel or whatever. And until we are, we have a limited suite of things we can do. Well, we're still in the war on terror. It's still a thing. So, you can, take military action against terrorist organizations legally. So, look, if an attorney was sitting here, they would challenge me till the cows come home on like what legally they can actually do. But and I'm sure they would be right. But designating them as such brings the biggest changes. It brings the military into the game in a way that they just were not and legally could not be before that designation. And of course, there's pluses and minuses to that. The military brings a very specific suite of tools to their problem sets. And, that's not necessarily relevant for law enforcement issues and some of these other issues we're dealing with. But I think that's the biggest change. And we're obviously seeing with, boats being blown up in the Caribbean and so on, that they are bringing the military into the game in a way that, we hadn't seen before. What I hope to see, though, is a few different things. So one, and I think this very much speaks to the current administration's kind of bravado and so on. Look, fentanyl has killed more Americans. It kills more Americans almost every month than 9/11 did on that terrible day. Yet we have not approached this the way we approached the war on terror in a real sense. And while in no world do I think we need to have tanks rolling into Mexico, we should do what Bush did with Pakistan leading up to the invasion of Afghanistan, where he sent Colin Powell in, and he said, Colin Powell talks to Musharraf, the head of the president of Pakistan, and says, look, you're either with us or against us. This very famous line. And, the Pakistanis were very conflicted on this. I mean, it's not like I don't think they were necessarily supporting terror, but they also didn't love us, and we're very much caught in the middle. But we swing a pretty big bat, and if we say that and say it very seriously to countries, they tend to listen, and we swing a way bigger bat in Mexico than we do in Pakistan. And I think that whether it's Marco Rubio or somebody like that needs to sit down with the president of Mexico and deliver this message, but deliver it specifically about fentanyl, not about the million other bad things these cartels do. There's no president, no administration, nobody can end criminality, but we could stop fentanyl. And if we deliver a very tailored message on this issue, say you're with us or against us on fentanyl, I think that is key, step one. Step two is we need to basically build Gallant Phoenix, but either on the southwest border or in Mexico, one or the other. Having proximity to the fight, so to speak, is important. We could put a whole bunch of agents and intel officers, military folks, and so on and so forth in certain places to do much of what we did in Gallant Phoenix and Jordan, but on the border. I believe a lot of that activity is happening, and hopefully it gets ramped up quick enough that they can start to do kind of what needs to be done. One of the other key pieces is guns. So while the Sinaloa cartel may, and many other cartels, flood the U.S. with narcotics, the U.S. has, for decades, flooded Mexico with weapons. And look, I believe in the Second Amendment. I think Americans have a right to bear arms. What I don't think, though, is that Mexican citizens in Mexico who are members of the Sinaloa cartel have a right to bear American arms. And someone, meaning us, should stop the flow of weapons from the United States to Mexico, because every meeting I sat in with the Mexican government where we were like, this is killing our people. You have to stop these guys from doing this. You guys have a military, you know these folks better than we do. You need to play the key role in stopping this. They would say, great, well, can you guys please stop arming them to the teeth with military grade weapons and so on and so forth? Because if they weren't armed that way, they would be a hell of a lot easier for us to beat. And I think that while we need to be tough in many ways, like the current administration is doing, and I think in some ways, have even tougher conversations than we've had to date, I do think we need to look in the mirror and we need to understand how we're contributing to this, not just from a demand perspective, because there is almost no demand in the United States for fentanyl, but from a supply perspective of supplying, what essentially is the entity killing more Americans than any other group in the world, the Sinaloa cartel, with weapons to defend itself from us and the Mexican government who are trying to stop them from doing that. So I think those key areas are kind of critically important if we're going to make progress on this. One of the reasons I wrote the book actually was as I was sitting down one day at the outdoor bar, the rooftop bar at the Sofitel Hotel, which is right next to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. And it's basically where all the government folks and others stay when they have meetings at the embassy. So I'm sitting there with our TCIUs, which are transnational criminal investigative units. And so basically they're elite Mexican law enforcement folks that we put on our payroll, and we polygraph them constantly because, corruption is a real issue, even for those who are the most ethical and so on. The cartel, they'll kill your family, so it's not about whether you're ethical or not. It's whether have they gotten to you or not, right? So they're on our payroll, but we polygraph them all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And they're the guys who go kick down doors for us in Mexico. Their stories are remarkable. This guy on his phone, as we're like doing tequila shots and knocking back Coronas, he's showing me his phone of next to some military or some big helicopter where they've got these guys, when they had the baklavas on and they're handcuffed up, and these guys are all in like tactical SWAT gear and everything, and they had just arrested them all. And he's telling me the story about how him and his guys at our direction, because again, they're on our payroll, they're doing what we're asking them to do, are like, he was head of the division or whatever. So he's crawling up this hill, like army crawl up this hill to go look at this house that they were going to take. And it was a big Sinaloa safe house or whatever, a lot of bad guys there. And as he gets to the top of the hill, right as he sticks his head over the hill, he looks up, and it's like at a Bugs Bunny or something, where there's like this huge, weapon that literally it's like an anti-aircraft, machine gun pointing at his face. And he says he's just sitting there like this. And immediately he said, thank God there wasn't a guy sitting at the other. He must have gotten up to take a piss or something. He didn't know. So he like rolls back down the hill and says to his guys, look, we got to figure out another way to do this. And so they went back and we figured out what they're doing. And then they go up and they take the guys down and everything. And these are guys that were our targets, you know? And I was like, man, you've got these heroes on the Mexico side who like want to do the right thing and kick down doors for us all day. You've got Americans who are demanding that our government do something about this. And then at the same time, you know, we're arming the bad guys to the teeth. We, the United States, are arming the bad guys to the teeth. And I was just like, God, what a crazy situation we found ourselves in, you know, between the cartel, moving into this space of these synthetic drugs like fentanyl, and everything else we've talked about. It's really just kind of a scary and very new situation we find ourselves in, and those guys are, not to mention all the victims in America are why I was like, God, this is a really compelling story that hopefully I'll tell, and hopefully a bunch of real academics will read it and go do a lot more research on what's happening, how it started, and how we can stop it.
Yeah, well, hopefully we continue to make progress against fentanyl and reduce these overdose deaths. Well, on that note, thank you so much for sitting down with us, Jake, and congrats on the book. Our guest today was Jake Braun. He's the executive director of the Cyber Policy Initiative at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and the author of the new book, Fentanyl, Fighting the Mass Poisoning of America and the Cartel Behind It. If you have follow-up questions for Jake or myself, our contact info is in the description below. Thanks so much, Jake.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of NCITE Insights. The National Counterterrorism, Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE, is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking to find out more? Check out our website at ncite.unomaha.edu or email us at ncite@unomaha.edu.